Hey everyone, and welcome to the Road to Damascus podcast. This is the first video ever, and I thought it only suiting to actually talk about the story that the entire channel is named after. And of course, the channel name is Damascus Road. So we'll get into a little bit more of the story, but the reason why I chose to name the channel Damascus Road was because it is the story of Paul, one of the biggest persecutor of Christians during his time, and the encounter he has on that road with the Lord, where he decides that encounter is going to change his life forever. And he goes from being one of the biggest persecutors of Christians to one of the biggest missionaries in the history of the world. And we all have that moment. If we decide that we are going to live for Christ and follow Jesus, we all have that moment. And it may not seem like it's as big of a deal because we weren't, on our way to persecute, and kill Christians the way Paul was. But God doesn't care. He is equally excited about every single Damascus Road moment that people have. And then once we have that moment, much as if you look at the life of Paul, things are not just sunshine and roses after that. Things can get hard. There are things that we maybe don't understand that we want enlightened on or help with, and that's hopefully what we can do on this channel. So when we have a video, we'll look at something from the Bible, whether it be a story or a verse, and just look at it and see what God can use to speak to us. I am not a biblical scholar or historian. I'm just somebody who is trying to learn the word and learn from God what I can when I read it. And hopefully that's what all of us are trying to do. And so we can encourage each other. Please leave comments. If I say something and you disagree, leave a comment. Let's talk about it. Let's see what God is speaking to each of us, and we can learn from each other. If you have praises or prayer requests, I would love to hear those so that we can rejoice and pray together. But we will just look at different stories or different verses and different topics that maybe Christians struggle with. And even if you are like, I'm not sure if I'm a Christian, as you read God's word and you study it, you're going to have that moment. You're going to have that Damascus Road moment where your life changes. And I just pray that this channel can be a small part of that as we look at different things throughout the Bible to help guide us. And like I said, I thought that this story was a pretty good place to start, and I appreciate you clicking and listening, and hopefully, I pray that you can get something out of this. So let's get started with the Road to Damascus story. So if you look in Acts 8, verse 1, it talks about how Saul was wreaking havoc basically for the church, and he was going into every house, dragging men and women off who were professing to be, of the faith. And so then you move forward into Acts 9, and this is where you hear about the actual encounter. Now, biblical scholars, again, could probably tell you more than I could about the translation of how this story happens, but we don't want to get so caught up in the details. Of course, we want to understand what truly happens, but we get so caught up in details that we don't understand what's actually being said. So, Saul is on his way to Damascus, and he has this authority to get these people who are claiming and professing the Lord, to get them and bring them back to Jerusalem. Like, he is hardcore out to get them. And while he's on this road, he's traveling with people, and suddenly there's this light and this voice, and he has this conversation with God saying, "Who are you?" And he says, "Well, it's me, basically the one you're persecuting." Now, just think about this for a second. I always think about it in terms of, we just had a presidential election, and then Jimmy Carter passes away. And these people who have just really spoken terribly of each other now are all convening in one location, and you're having to look each other in the eye, knowing what you've said about each other and how you've acted and kind of persecuted each other to an extent. Well, I kind of think about encounters like that. So here you are, quote unquote, face to face with the person that you have been just really out to get. He has been out to get. He did not believe in Jesus. He did not believe that the followers should be allowed to worship like they were. He just wasn't having any of it. And so now he's hearing this voice. Can you imagine how he feels? And I think, do you feel ashamed right in that moment? Are you thinking, oh my gosh, I've been talking so badly about you, and here you are talking to me. Is he embarrassed or ashamed? Is he scared? Oh my goodness, I've been talking bad about you, and here is this voice out of nowhere. There has to be some truth behind this. Is he just scared? So I just think, as a human, like, what emotions he has in that moment. Now, it says that the people who were traveling with him heard the voice but didn't see anybody, and that could mean that they actually heard everything that Saul heard. It could mean that they heard a noise but couldn't interpret it, and that only Saul really understood. But again, I don't know if that's super relevant, because I think God was clearly talking directly to Saul in that moment. And so then he goes on, his friends take him, he's blinded for 3 days, and then God tells Ananias to go and basically remove his blindness. And then after that, he becomes Paul. Now, does God anoint him the name Paul? I don't really think that that's what scripture tells us. There are, again, different things. If you look back to translation, are Saul and Paul just, one's a Greek translation, one's another? Was it the same name? He just gets called something different. But he does start going by this name now for whatever reason. And so there's this clear transformation, even in a name change, maybe not given to him by God, but that he wants to totally get rid of the life that he had before him, perhaps, even if they were interchangeable names. We know him now as Paul. And we know him looking back in history. That is where really it gets to even us here. And if you're listening and you're here in America, or even in, the Western world at all, that without all of the missionary exploits of Paul, that really we would not be where we are. God uses him to just cover so much ground and share to so many people, that if you trace it back, that's how Christianity kind of becomes so big. And he didn't use, so I think that this whole story just has so much in it, because he didn't use somebody who was high and mighty and perfect. And God has a way of doing that. If you look throughout the Bible, he calls people who do not have high stature. He calls people who have made mistakes that would almost seem unforgivable. Yeah, we all sin, but it's not like, oh, I accidentally, worked on the Sabbath, or I didn't give 10% of my money. We're talking he persecuted Christians, and God chose to use him. And I think that that is such a testament to God wanting to use anybody, and God forgiving anything when we turn and look to him. And so that's his moment. That's his moment. And I think that you're talking about walking on a road, hearing a voice, seeing a blinding light, being blind for 3 days. It doesn't get a whole lot bigger than that. And so that speaks to the fact that what happened was undeniably from God. Now, do we all have those encounters? Absolutely not. I don't know anybody who's been blinded for 3 days and then they can see again. I'm sure it has happened, but I don't know that. But do I know of encounters that people have had that absolutely 100% could not have come from anywhere but from the Lord? And that is 100% true. So I think he gives us these scenarios that we can't question that they are from God. And I think that's so important, because anytime that we start to lose our faith, we need to go back to that Damascus Road moment and say, I know God is with me, because God was there and God showed me this, and that couldn't have come from anywhere else. And he didn't do that just for me to falter now. He didn't give me that moment just to turn away now. And he is willing to use people like Paul, people like me, to us, people who are not perfect in any way, to share the gospel. And I think that's so important, because I can only imagine when Paul started his missionary journeys, how people doubted him, or just stood in disbelief, like, are you for real the same guy? Like, I don't even believe this. But that made them probably almost more inclined to listen to his story, because they knew what he was like before. If you've ever seen somebody who does just a complete 180 for God, and it's like they're a totally different person, it's an amazing thing. But I think sometimes people, like me, we grow up in church, and thank the Lord, I've never had a life full of drugs or anything like that, to where a complete 180 on the outside. I've not had that. People don't maybe look at me and see that, but it's still a 180 of the heart. Anytime you go from God wasn't in your heart to God is in your heart, that's a 180. It doesn't have to look that way on the outside to everybody else, because to God, everybody's conversion is just as significant and just as precious to Him. So I just want us all to remember that God is going to use anybody. And it's funny because I almost want to say God is going to use anybody who is willing. When Saul was on his way to Damascus, I don't think he was ready and willing to work for the Lord. He got caught completely off guard, and sometimes God's going to do that to us as well. And sometimes that is what we need, because if we wait until we're ready, we're never going to be ready. We're never going to have that perfect moment when we say, God, I will give up everything for you. I will do whatever you ask me to do. So He has to meet us where we are and just kind of kick us in the pants sometimes and say, but now is the time. Now is when I'm choosing you, and this is how we're going to do this, and this is when we're going to do it. And we just have to go with it. And so I think there's just so much to remember about that moment in Paul's life, in our own lives, and how precious that moment can be when we are struggling with so many other things, to cling to that moment and know that that is the same God that we had in our Damascus Road moment. That's the same God that is with us every single day. So if you have other thoughts on this story or things that God has taught you through this story, please leave it in the comments. Please share with us. If you have prayer requests, if you have not had your Damascus Road moment yet, God is waiting. He is there on that road waiting for you. And we are praying that you have that moment as soon as possible. Please tune in to the next podcast. If you have a particular Bible story that you would like to hear about, please let me know. Everyone have a blessed day, and thanks for listening.